we have been discussing saying that any OPD in the rural areas, we have about 4 to 5% of the patients who have urology problems. And we have been discussing that with the limited equipment and investment, we can treat about half of them. So we said if you're able to do a urodynamic study or bladder pressure studies, and most of the symptoms, you're able to combine the bladder pressure studies, view inside the bladder. And if you learn minor procedures like double G stenting, that would help us to treat quite a bit of the urinary stone problem. But as far as emergencies are concerned, it's again very rare. It's in fact 1 or 1.5 per 100,000 population is the incidence of emergencies. And only about 2 to 3% of emergencies which present any hospital will have a urology problem. This is about 2 to 3% of surgical emergencies. And most of them are handled by general surgeons. But one of the important things which needs immediate treatment is urinary colic. Although many of the men don't realize it, it is almost as painful as labor pain. At least in the labor pain, once a child is born, the whole pain is gone and people are happy. But with the urinary colic, the pain can be very, very severe. So it needs knowledge and treatment immediately. So we'll see one of the most common complications or emergencies that we encounter. And the most common one probably we have is the urinary retention. It can occur both in men and women. And the causes, of course, are different in men and some are different in women. And some causes could be common to both. In men, the commonest cause of urinary retention is bladder outflow obstruction, either BPH or CA prostate. And sometimes urinary strictures, they can also cause obstruction and retention. And sometimes we'll be surprised even small conditions or minor conditions like phimosis, if untreated, can lead to urinary retention. So this again depends on the age group, the older age group where retention is the most common. And prostatitis, or sometimes the prostate volume suddenly increases as an infarct, or there is infection or inflammation. And in women, it's again, if there is a prolapse or a cystocele, and if there is a large uterus, or there is a neurovesical dysfunction, all these can present as obstruction. Another common cause is if there is any bleeding or blood clots in the bladder or urethra. And sometimes even things as innocuous as a fecal impaction can lead to urinary retention. But you'll be surprised that the most common cause of urinary retention, which needs catheterization, is if somebody forgets to put a catheter after spinal anesthesia. So that has been listed as in many series as one of the most common causes. So actually in the previous class we did a lot of study about BPH and why and how the symptoms occur. So now we look at mostly the problem which is due to the retention. And very often it is precipitated when people postpone maturation. So generally in rural areas, they're not too concerned about the symptoms because it's frequency, they don't mind because they have nothing else to do. And anyway, they don't feel very sleepy at night, say they don't mind getting up several times to go to the toilet. And the post stream, they think it's part of growing up. So many of the rural patients are not unduly worried about the lower urinary tract symptoms which occur with BPH. But then suddenly, they are worried because they can't pass anymore. And most of the time, it is because they withhold passing urine. So when we do a bladder pressure studies, we find that you get the first sensation of voiding when you have about 350 ml or 400 ml. Then you have the urgency. And the reason is that the muscles of the bladder are arranged in such a way that when the capacity increases, the pressure actually doesn't increase inside. But then once it goes beyond a certain level, this doesn't happen. The pressure keeps increasing. And that's why we feel the urgency. And when the muscles are stretched too much, they cannot contract very effectively. So when they postpone maturation, they may not be able to, as it is, they have a problem because normally you need to generate about 60 centimeters of bladder pressure to start passing urine. And because the obstruction due to prostate, it would already been to about 80 or 90. And then when they stretch it further, they won't be able to, muscles won't be able to generate that much pressure, and then they have these acute painful retention. And as I mentioned a little while ago, sometimes the obstruction can suddenly increase if there is any infarct in the prostate. The prostate site suddenly increases, there is a small bleed, if there is infarction, inflammation, all these things can cause an obstruction. But then the easiest thing to do is when there is a BPH, unlike if there is a stricture or any other problem, it's not very difficult to pass a catheter. So again, you need to remember that what I told last time, while catheterizing, it's important to be very, very gentle and give prophylactic antibiotics, because whenever there is a retention, it means there is some amount of infection. Because normally also we have some bacteria in the bladder and the doubling time is 20 minutes. But then you don't get significant infection because we empty the bladder. But when there is retention, obviously there has been there for a long time. And there is enough bacteria that have multiplied already. So give an antibiotic, so give sufficient lubrication, use a lot of jelly, and then make sure that the curve that we talked about is all right. There's only one curve to negotiate. And keep slowly pushing the catheter. And when you reach the level of the sphincter, there will always be resistance because the patient doesn't like all these manipulations. So then the thing to do is to keep weighting there gently. And because they're voluntarily trying to hold the sphincter tight, they will relax, and the moment you relax, the catheter will slip in. But then any violent pushing in, even though the catheters are rubber and gentle, this can cause sufficient injury to cause problems later. So you need to be very careful that you use sufficient lubrication and gentleness. And again, remember the curve. So once you're able to successfully catheterize the bladder, then suddenly there is a decompression. So this sudden decompression again can cause some bleeding. So you need to be careful of that and make sure that, okay, can you go back to the previous slide? Okay. And make sure that they have, they take sufficient antibiotics and sufficient fluid intake to maintain a good output. And very often, whatever caused the retention, if it is due to infarction or inflammation or swelling, sometimes settles down when the obstruction is relieved. Because whenever you strain, that again forces blood into those tissues, and the reaction of the body again is there when you're trying to overcome obstruction. But then when the obstruction is relieved, then these things settle down in a day or two. And you can give a trial of void. So if the acute problem settles down, patient may be able to void again. But if that doesn't happen, then you need to have continuous bladder drainage. Okay. So then sometimes if it is not due to BPH, if there is a stricture, or if there is an injury, or if there is a stone, you may not be able to pass a catheter. Then what do? The patient is in, you must remember that they will be in severe distress, because once it reaches a level about 350 ml, then you have a severe urgency or urge to pass urine. And as the bladder keeps increasing in size, the pain becomes even more severe. So if we're not able to do it, and if you're referring somewhere, it's better to drain the bladder and then send them. So one of the easy thing to do is to drain with a long spinal needle. So clean and drape over the pubic bone, and you can try and aspirate as much as possible. And sometimes in a sterile setup, you can also connect IV tubing so that it drains and empties the bladder. But this is only an emergency situation, and if you don't have the means. But otherwise, it's good to do a suprapubic drainage. And here again, you need to remember that later on, you need to tackle what the problem is. So if there may be a trauma or a urethral disconnection or a stricture. So we would like, as a urologist, we like to use the SPC passage for doing any procedures. Or maybe Casey can show that video, this thing, and then we'll continue. So what happens is that, especially if there is urethral trauma, and you can have one gentle attempt to pass the Foley's catheter. If it doesn't go, then you need to do a SPC. So when you're doing SPC, you need to remember that you should stay as much away from the pubic as possible.
So this is a patient who had a road traffic accident and had needed a SPC 3 years ago. And he was in a SPC and they were not able to pass any urine from below. So last time what we did was what is called a go-through EAU. Because it's a total blockage, we need to scope from above and below and cut only the scar tissue. That will slowly lead to the strictured area. And we managed to put in an 18-French catheter from below. So this time we are doing a repeat procedure to cut and put a much larger catheter. The first step in doing EAU, whether the repeat or first, is to pass a guide wire. Earlier, you can also use an open-ended catheter. Okay, so it doesn't seem to go completely. What you can do.
Whenever possible, it's always important to keep a guide wire to guide you, because once there is bleeding, it's very difficult to see things around.
Now we are in the urinary bladder. So we use the half round sheath. See, here is probably a false passage. This is created by earlier catheterization effort.
See, one other thing probably you need to notice that even this time, even though guide wire is a very flexible thing, smooth at the tip, still it can cause, it didn't go in neatly. It did get stuck somewhere. And if you use a force, it can cause false passages, as the video shows.
When you cut the scar tissue, generally it doesn't bleed much. But it's important to do self-calibration afterwards. Jelly and
go back to the
French catheter.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to show this video was that we needed to show the placement of the SPC. the further you place away from the pubic tubercle, it's easier for us to do the procedure and get in and see. If it's very close, then you enter the bladder at right angles and then turning again, and the urethra orifice will be somewhere there. So it will be very difficult to see all those things. So, but then if you go too high, then you'll be in the peritoneal cavity. You don't want that to happen. So that you need to, whenever you place the suprapubic catheter, you need to remember that. It's sort of, you're able to feel the dome of the bladder and the pubic tubercle as high as possible, as convenient place. You should place the SPC trocarine cannula. So it's easy to, before doing this thing, all you need to do is make a small incision in the skin, then the fascia, and it should be sufficient to pass your finger and you can actually feel the bladder. Then once you feel the bladder, you put in a syringe and aspirate to make sure it is the bladder and you're sucking out urine. And then with the SPC trocarine cannula, you can go in. But again, once you do that, then you have to remember that they might have diuresis and bleeding and things after that. So you need to monitor the patient, especially the urine output after that. The next most common presentation is the loin pain, the classic ureteric colic, groin to loin pain. And here the classic description is that patient rolls in pain because it's a very severe pain. And unlike in peritonitis, where if the patient stays still, there's some amount of relief. Here, nothing gives the patient any relief. So they keep rolling in pain. And if there is vomiting, it generally indicates that it's an ongoing process. Say like if the stone is in the kidney and then if you're coming down the ureter. And the process is not complete as long as there is vomiting. And if there is a fever, it means that there is a obstruction and it's been the long standing. And you need to relieve the obstruction as soon as possible. And most of the patients, like when we did most of the survey that we did in areas which are not actually called the stone blood, even there, 4 to 5% of the patients presented any OPD had these ureteric colics. And then in these stone areas, especially hot, humid areas where the water intake is less, the incidence is far higher. And of course, there are many differential diagnoses for loin pain, starting from aneurysm, myocardial infarction, acute appendicitis, torsion, bowel, and so on. But again, you need to remember the most common cause is the ureteric colic or stones in the ureter. While all the other things are fairly rare, even urologists who treat quite a bit of these do not see many of these often. And they have the other symptom which helps them to differentiate it. Okay, so what are the investigations do? Most of the places, the KUB should suffice. If you know how to read the KUB, if you can figure out the kidney, the ureter, the course of the ureter, and the vesico-ureteric junction, then it's fairly easy to identify any radiopaque densities along this. And if there is a symptoms, if urine micro shows RBCs, then it's very likely that they'll have a stone. And of course, uric acid stones might not be radio opaque, they may be radiolucent. But again, very often these are mixed stones, and a little bit of opacity will be there if you have a good X-ray. So the most important investigation in a rural area is the X-ray of the KUB. If you have a facility for ultrasound, that's helpful because it'll show some hydronephrosis or fullness of the calyces. But again, it can show only the renal stones. And if there is a sufficient amount of urine around the stone and there is a block. But if it's along the ureter and not much of obstruction, ultrasound might not be a useful investigation. So then what do you do in a rural area? So what we recommend is that generally you give tamsulosin. This is an alpha blocker which is specific to the ureteric muscles. It can cause dilatation and alkalinize the urine, because if there is a uric acid component, it can dissolve in alkaline urine. And we also give antibiotics and anti-inflammatory agents, because these always there is some amount of infection if there is any obstruction, and again inflammation if there is any obstruction. So relieving the inflammation, relieving the infection, and causing some amount of diuresis can relieve these obstruction if they are due to small stones. And again, the shape of a stone also can give you an indication of whether it is possible to relieve or not. So if it is usually many of them which come down the ureter shaped like a rice grain, so that so these stones can easily pass through. Or if there are smooth stones, they can also comfortably pass through. But if the edges are rough and the way it's lying down looks as though it is difficult for it to pass, then you might have to do some procedures to get it. And one other thing you do notice is the C-reactive protein, because that again, if these are there, it might indicate obstruction and inflammation, and fairly quick treatment is necessary in this case. Then the other most common emergency is hematuria, or blood in the urine. And of course, if it is gross hematuria, the patient will obviously know it and they come present with that. And equally important is microscopic hematuria. When you examine the urine for some other cause, you find red blood cells in the urine. And they can starting from the kidney, renal tumor, any tumors around the urothelium, urinary bladder, prostate. All these can cause hematuria. The good thing about it is that because urine keeps washing away this urothelium, it's possible to detect all these malignancies fairly early. We had patients whom we diagnosed have a bladder tumor, and we've been treating for almost 10 to 15 years now. And this is because they presented early before it invaded the muscles. And it's possible to treat them in a right way and keep them asymptomatic for a long time because of the early diagnosis. So it's a good thing that urine is able to wash away the blood and make us come to a diagnosis soon, especially in tumors. And urothelial tumors is one of those which has precipitating factors, where there has been good correlation between smoking and working in certain factories or dye industries and so on. So when these also can be avoided. And of course, stones is another common cause of hematuria. Infection per se can cause hematuria. And rarely urinary tract trauma, because trauma is not so common because kidney is sort of fairly well protected. And then in countries like India, TB is always a problem. It can mimic anything. So TB also is a fairly common cause of blood in the urine. These are rare causes, the medical causes, blood dyscrasias, pyelonephritis, glomerulonephritis, interstitial nephritis. But then you need to remember these also can contribute to, it's not only the surgical diseases which cause hematuria. These medical causes are also known to cause hematuria. Then the type of hematuria can give some amount of indication where the blood originates from. If that's initial hematuria, or when you're starting to pass urine, the fluid drops of blood, it probably indicates urethral cause, because if there is any stricture or there is a small stone in the urethra, a small lesion in the urethra, the blood collects there. And when they start passing urine, it pushes the blood out. So the first thing which will come out is the urine. Again, you can have what is called the terminal hematuria. Terminal hematuria occurs when at the end of the micturition, then you have blood. This is common with the bladder causes. If there is a small tumor or stone in the bladder, toward the end of the bladder, when the muscles contract or the walls of the bladder rub against each other, that is the time it can bleed. And classically, if the bleeding is from above, say from the kidney, then it's a total hematuria because the entire urine is mixed with the blood. And again, but these are not very standardized in that it can be anything, because even with a bladder tumor, the blood can come at the beginning. If there's a clot, they may be able to pass the clot first, or it may be even total if there's enough time for the blood to get mixed with the urine, or it may be terminal also. So it's not clear cut, but this gives an indication of where the origin of the blood may be. And pain is another indication that it may be due to a stone. And if there is dysuria, it probably indicates cystitis. And here again, the simple investigation very often gives you the diagnosis, which is ultrasound and KUB. Okay, there's a couple of things you need to remember about bleeding in the urinary tract. Very often, people are very happy to give ethamsalate or tranexamic acid when there is a bleed, because it forms clots. And in most of the places, if there is a clot, that will prevent the blood vessels from bleeding further. But bladder and prostate tissue is a little different in that there are muscles which will prevent venous bleeding when they collapse, because when they are distended, the muscle fibers are separated and the venous veins in between, they open up and they continue to bleed. So if the muscles collapse, then the bleeding will stop. But if a clot forms over it, it'll prevent the muscle from collapsing completely in that area and preventing bleeding. Same thing occurs in prostatic bed. So in both prostate and bladder, it's safer not to use ethamsalate or tranexamic acid because we don't want these clots to form. And another problem with this clot formation is that they can join together and form a clot, which will prevent the urine from coming out. So if there is an obstruction and the bladder distance or the prostatic bed distance, it'll increase the bleeding. So generally we try and avoid using ethamsalate or tranexamic acid if the suspected blood bleeding is from the prostate or the bladder. And if it is possible to pass a 3-way and you wash it out, because washing, what happens is that clears all these small clots and makes the bladder collapse. So just the bladder collapsing very often is enough to prevent most of the venous bleeding. If it's arterial bleed, of course, these things may not help. But most of the bleeding, fortunately, is venous. And collapsed bladder is good enough. So if we have a 3-way and wash, that should suffice. And if we have a cystoscopy and wash, that is better, because through the catheter, it might be difficult to wash. So you might be wondering what to do in a rural area. We don't have all the setup. So the laptop cystoscope that we have been talking about all these weeks allows you to use a Bugbee electrode. It's a small electrode with a tip which can use to coagulate the bleeding points. So the Bugbee electrode scopy can comfortably wash the bladder from the clots, and it'll be able to visualize and then able to specifically locate, and if there is any bleeding point, you can cauterize the bleeding point. But then again, you have to remember that it's not the best of the instrument, because good telescope and camera is necessary if there is a bleeding. If you're absolutely normal and clear urine, clear irrigating fluid and no lesion in the bladder. There's hardly any difference between the low camera or a high camera or good quality one or low quality one. But the moment there is any bleeding or the vision is not clear, then that is the time when the quality matters. But of course, having a little bit of vision is far better than not having any vision at all. So when you have these facilities, better to use the lateral cystoscope and give a nice wash. And if you're able to locate the bleeder, use the bug-buoy electrode to cauterize the bleeder. So this is another uncommon lesion which probably particular to the urology, the priapism. So this is the definition of that. If the erection lasts for more than 4 hours, then it's called priapism. And normally it doesn't last that long. Generally it doesn't last more than 5 minutes or at most 10 minutes. But then again, the most common cause is iatrogenic. When you use papaverine or any injections to cause artificial erection. The way the erection occurs is that you have both arterial and venous blood in the penis. So during erection time, the venous blood flow is blocked. So it becomes tense with the blood. And that's what causes erection. And there is a vasodilatation or venous dilatation. Then the erection, the penis becomes flaccid. And there are 2 types of priapism. One is ischemic and one is non-ischemic. Ischemic when there is ischemia or loss of blood supply. And ischemic erections are painful because it causes ischemia and then insufficient blood supply, which irritates the nerves and causes pain. And if it lasts for more than 24 hours, as in the example I said in the beginning, it can cause irreversible damage. So it's important to treat it as quickly as possible. So you cannot wait to refer the patient elsewhere. So the reversible causes, as I said, the most common causes iatrogenic or intracaverous injections. Then same thing can occur with sickle cell anemia or leukemia. So if it is, these are, it'll go by itself and they're reversible. And irreversible, again, the commonest cause, nobody knows what the cause is. But trauma, substance abuse, antidepressants, all these are known to cause this sort of irreversible priapism. So how do you treat it? So one way of immediate relief is that it's basically collected blood which causes the problem. So you can aspirate with the needle and irrigate with the sympathoromimetics like epinephrine, adrenaline, phenylephrine. So these things, most of the time, 95% of the time, just irrigating with the adrenaline solution is enough to relieve the priapism. But then sometimes, very rarely, you might need to do a cavernoglandular shunts. The easy way of doing it is to use a bioptic gun to pass it through the glands and go to one of the corpora and fire it. So this is enough to create a shunt, which will relieve the priapism. Okay, so this is again an uncommon one, but then as I said in the example, especially in elderly, the penis can rupture. And if treated immediately, it is possible to restore the blood supply and they can continue to have erections. But if it takes more than 24 hours, then very often it's only a cosmetic repair that they can do. And beyond the area where it is ruptured, it will become flaccid. Acute scrotal pain is another emergency, which most of the time it's the general surgeons who tackle it. But then you need to know how to diagnose torsion. The torsion can occur at the spermatic cord, testes or any of these appendages. And you need to remember that it's a congenital deformity which allows this torsion. So examining the other side, which is not painful, will give you a clue to what has happened in the side which is painful. And it's important to start examining with the side which is not painful, so that the patient will allow you to later on, if necessary, examine the side which is painful. And epididymitis or epididymoarthritis, which is inflammation and infection, can present similar to it. And you need to recognize this because epididymoarthritis can be treated with medication or conservative treatment, while surgical treatment is necessary if there is any torsion. Renal trauma again is fairly rare because kidney is well protected by the ribs and muscles. And most of the time, conservative treatment is enough. 95% of the time, you don't need to really do anything except have rest and follow up. And only if there is a pulsatile hematoma and the bleed is continuing, it warrants an exploration. And especially in rural areas, if the other kidney is normal, nephrectomy is a safer option because even in a normal kidney, if you open the kidney for nephrolithotomy and so on, the chances of secondary hemorrhage and bleed from there are fairly high. So if you're not able to tackle it, it's safer to do a nephrectomy in a rural area. Ureteric injuries, again, same reasoning applies for ureteric injury as renal injuries, because most of them are only iatrogenic injuries, because it's very, very rare for any penetrating injuries to specifically injure the ureter. But then intraoperative injuries are common with gynecology surgery or ureteroendoscopy or even cesarean section, laparoscopic surgeries. Even orthopedic surgeries have been associated with the ureteric injuries. But then, unfortunately, these are not, quite a bit of them are not diagnosed at surgery. If they were diagnosed, it's fairly easy to repair at that time. You just can pass a stent and do repairs over it. But then if it causes prolonged ileus, sepsis, you need to first drain it and then later on do some reconstructive surgeries. Okay, so as you said, if you're able to recognize the injury, it is easy to treat at that time. All you need is a stent, and even if you're not able to do a very good closure, very often if there's no distal obstruction, it'll heal well if they have a stent. And partial transection and anastomosis is important. So one other thing you need to remember that it's a circular structure. So any injury or any suturing will cause narrowing, which further reduces the lumen. So you need to make it wider before you start suturing it. And then if there is any loss of bladder tissue, then reimplantation with what we call a Bovary flap. You make a tube from the bladder and then you can join it. Or if maybe even simpler to take the ureter from one side to the other side and reimplant it. Okay, again, bladder rupture, unlike the rupture of the kidney or trauma to the ureter, this can be a fairly common thing, especially if there is any blunt trauma to the abdomen, when there is a full bladder. And this often happens in people who are drunk, because the drinking itself causes a fair amount of diuresis. They already have a full bladder, and their senses are blunted because they are drunk. And because they are drunk, they fall and injure, or they get into a fight and injure. And they present also fairly late, In fact, we had many instances where they presented 2 or 3 days later with severe peritonitis and so on. But then treatment is as like any other this thing, you need to give a proper antibiotic coverage, do a diagnostic laparoscopy or laparotomy, and then bladder you need to close in layers and leave the bladder with continuous drainage for a long time, at least a month, for it to heal properly. And the rupture again can be both intraperitoneal or extraperitoneal. Both you need to, unless you recognize and treat, it might be difficult. So intraperitoneal diagnostic lab is necessary. Extraperitoneal is better to do an open one and treat. Okay, the urethral rupture. This is another common injury nowadays we find, especially in road traffic accidents. And the bladder rupture, the clinical triad they say is blood in the penis, then the difficult to void, and suprapubic tenderness. So bladder, as I said, once it's diagnosed, you do a laparotomy or a laparoscopy and layered closure. If it is a urethral injury, then very often we don't know the status of the urethra. So sometimes it may be just a small tear and extravasation of urine may be there. But quite often both the ends torn and they separate from each other. Sometimes the separation can be almost up to 1 centimeter and they're not in alignment because the bones and both sides move quite far away from each other. So if there is a possibility, you can give a gentle trial with passing a catheter. Again, we need to remember that even a little bit of tissue is stuck and both the ends are nearby. Even though 80 and 90% the urethra ruptured. Later on, doing endoscopic ureterotomy much easier if there is a little bit of connection between the both ends. So any manipulation trying to pass a catheter or any manipulation there, whatever little is held up will tear and move away. So you might actually make it worse. If you think that injury is not severe enough, so then it is possible to gently attempt one catheterization. If it goes into the bladder, it's fine. If it does not go, there's no point in doing any repeated things. The thing to do is to do a SPC and wait. And you need to wait till the entire infection, inflammation, everything subsides. And ideally, we need to repair it after 3 to 4 months. And generally, the repairs are very difficult and complex. But then we have a very good experience of doing what we call core-through or blind ureterotomy. So this is where we said if you have a good amount of distance between the pubic symphysis and the SPC, then we can do scopies from above and below. And we keep cutting the scar tissue and generally cutting in the direction of the bladder. When you're able to reach the bladder and make both ends meet, then it saves a lot of big major surgery for the patient. And they can keep doing self-calibration daily, and many people, 20, 30 people whom we had done go through EAU, who have been comfortable with just self-calibrations. But then if it is not possible, if the distance is more than 1 centimeter, then we need a formal repair. Okay. This is another thing we need to really understand is that any obstructive symptoms can cause severe sepsis. See, normally the no obstruction, we often say it is sort of semi-sterile procedure. We take a lot of shortcuts and we're not bothered too much of with sterility as orthopedic surgeons would be, and so on. The reason is that when we pass urine, the entire bacteria comes out. But again, if you drink more water and have a good hydration, again, all these bacteria can be flushed out. But then if there is any obstruction, the infection can be very, very significant and serious. And that is the reason, if they suspect any obstruction, important to have an adequate antibiotic cover. If you don't know what the organism is, we generally give a third generation cephalosporin and aminoglycosides. And then give sufficient time. And also, if you do any procedure, we need to have adequate hydration at that time. And once the obstruction is relieved also, you need to be careful of, once the sudden release of obstruction, there can be diuresis or what they call Diethel's crisis could be there. And then the obstruction can occur again. So you need to continue the antibiotics. But sometimes they may even require ICU treatment, inotropes, if there is a significant obstruction. So in general, the urology emergencies, even though they are not very frequent, only about 1% of the surgical emergencies which come to any of the outpatients or emergency departments, can be tackled most of the time by non-urologists or general surgery people. And the simple things to remember are that you need to be gentle. You need to be quick in diagnosing and gentle treatment.
Nani, I had a patient who had a urinary trauma. Actually, 2 months back, he came with a big urinoma. Actually, sonology people diagnose and misdiagnose as sauce abscess. So we put a pigtail catheter there. We drained around 2,000 ml of urine there. Now, post-operatively, we have put a stent there. In the patient had hydronephrosis, then he had trauma. So we put a stent, DJ stent. Now the urinoma collection is coming very less. Now, what further we can do for that?
See, if we can, when the stent is in place without any problem.
No. There is no stricture, nothing.
Okay.
There was a urinoma, retropetal collection, post-traumatic.
See, if there is no distal obstruction,
the patient
most
came
of
2
them
months
will
later.
settle down.
No. There is no distal obstruction. On CT, we could find there was a small gap from where the urine was leaking in the retroperitoneum. So we put a DJ stent. Now the leakage is very less. The collection is coming very less. Now it is 50 ml or so, which was 1,000 daily. So now further what we can do, we should wait or we should go for repair. I want to ask that.
See,
otherwise kidney is normal. Kidney is normal otherwise.
So most of the time we can actually wait.
Okay. So what time we should wait for that?
So you can wait.
How much time?
You need the stent till less than about 15-20 ml is there.
Okay.
And we need to keep the stent. We need to keep a long-term stent and keep stent for further 6 months or so. Because what happens is that if you're doing, if you're opening and repairing it, you still, you need to do a lot of dissection. And that area, again, already without much of a blood supply. So the problems associated are always there. So you need to, might land up putting in a stent for a much longer time. But if you can wait conservatively and keep changing the stent, that should suffice.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
See, again, as I said earlier, because one of the problem with the ureter is that the blood supply comes from above and below. There's not too much of blood supply.
Ureter is normal. It came from middle pole of the kidney. There was a small leak there. We
So
put
you
a
don't
DJ stent.
have-
Ureter is normal. Distally, there is no obstruction. It is normal.
So usually, that is the reason it'll heal without much of a problem.
Okay.
So as long as there is no distal obstruction.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Anything else you want to add and tell the others? Okay, you can finish the video and then next.
Yeah, we are getting a lot of cases of this traumatic rupture of the urethra, sexual uterus, and also so we are doing the dilatation. Now we have a urologist, so we are doing now OIU also. So we are
Okay.
continuing with the OIU, TRBT, TRP. But many chronic urinary infections are we are getting a very much problem. Everything is normal, but still the patient is finding with cystitis, finding that they have a suprapubic pain, they are burning in micturition. Everything other thing is normal. The culture is normal, everything is normal. What to
What
do
about
for them?
tuberculosis is common in your areas?
It is common, but not genital is not common. Abdominal is very common. We have cultured for tuberculosis also, but it was negative, totally negative. We have a CBNet also, advanced CBNet culture we have. We have Gene Express, everything we have. We have done everything. It was normal. But patient still has pain. They have a suprapubic pain or burning in micturition. What to do for them?
See, one other thing is because almost a third of the spinal cord nerve supply go to the bladder. So you do a systematogram and see what really causes the pain.
We have done this thing, urodynamic studies also. Everything was normal, sir. Culture was normal. Everything was normal. I don't know why
there
this
should be some
patient.
cause for the pains, whether it's increased significant
Yeah.
post-void residue or whether the poor compliance or see sometimes
We are getting
because the inflammation, the compliance, the elasticity of the muscle is not there. So when with the smaller increase in volume, the pressure increases. So those sort of this thing, if you give some anticholinergic, sometimes they may help. So again, it depends on individual cases of what you find in CMG.
right. We'll try that.
Yeah.
Because we are finding this rural people. We are coming here. They are coming with chronic pain, with cystitis, chronic cystitis, without any cause. We could not find any cause for them. Every investigation has been done, even cystoscopies, everything, but we could not find anything. Even IVP, okay, there's something infection coming from above. Everything is normal. They are the problems in the case.
Maybe you should do a study with the low-cost systematogram and see.
We have seen. Okay, we'll see that. We'll do it. Try that one
Because
also.
see, the thing is, the standard systematogram is the machine which does most of the thing. People are not there. So unless you're there, then you can actually, if you're watching the procedure, then you can interpret and find out when the pain is there and what causes it.
Yes. We'll try that, definitely.
Okay, there's no other question. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye. Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye.